Today, we think of the Romans as all-powerful imperialists, mythologized to the point where their leaders are seen as more like gods than human beings. But back in 390 BC, ancient Rome was still very much a regional power, confined to the Latin-speaking central part of Italy. To the north of Roman territory at that time lay various other Italian city-states and, beyond them, the many tribes of the warlike Gauls. A few years earlier, the Gauls had poured over the Alps and invaded much of northern modern-day Italy, shaking up the balance of power in the region. According to Livy, they were called to the Etruscan city of Clusium by Aruns, who wanted to take revenge on Lucum for having seduced his wife. However, Lucum was very influential and Aruns knew that he would need outside help to take revenge. Gallic tribes were to be the tool of his revenge. When the Senones appeared, the inhabitants of Clusium fell pale in fear and asked Rome for help. In response to Clusium's pleas for help, the Roman Senate sent envoys, the sons of Fabius Ambustus, to forewarn the invading Gauls. The envoys came in peace, but tempers soon flared. The Gauls stated that they had no quarrels with the Romans, but when asked as to what right they had to the lands of the Etruscans, the Gauls replied that they carried their right in their weapons, and that everything belonged to the brave. This outraged Lucumo's people so much that a violent scuffle broke out and, amid the random violence, one of the Fabii brothers killed a Gallic chieftain. This act violated Rome's neutrality and broke the primitive rules of war. Unsure on how to deal with the Roman aggression, King Brennus pulled his army back to his Senones homelands. The Gallic chiefs held councils to figure how to deal with the Romans. Their pride stung, and it was, no doubt, mostly the younger nobles who called for war. However, it was the cooler heads of the elders that prevailed. Gallic ambassadors were sent to Rome, where they petitioned the Senate to hand over the Fabii to the Gauls. Although both the Senate and the Facials were sympathetic to the Gauls, but the father of the Fabii had more influence. Not only did the Fabii not surrender, they were elected as consular tribunes and as such given command of the army. To the Gauls this was a slap in the face. The envoys threatened war and returned to their people. Soon messages from Clusium arrived at Rome. The Gauls had arisen in rage against Rome and with celerity were storming southward. In fear of the Gallic hordes, rural folk took to flight and cities shut their gates. But for the most part, the Gauls spared the countryside of Rome's neighbors. Everywhere they went, the Gauls shouted that they were going to Rome. Despite all this, the Romans remained complacent. Although alarmed by the speed of the Gallic advance, the Roman commanders were sure that they could handle the barbarian rabble. An army was hastily raised by a levy. Less than 11 miles from Rome, the Romans intercepted the Gauls on July 18, 390 BC on the left bank of the Tiber near its confluence with the river Allia. Whatever their preconceptions, the Romans were shocked at the sight of the Gallic army. Here was no orderly phalanx confronting them, but around 30,000 strong mob of tall, big-boned, fair-skinned men. The Gauls had full mustaches and manes of long hair swept back over their brows. The bulk of their army consisted of light infantry with oval shields and long swords. Large numbers were completely naked, in accordance with religious and social customs, and wore torques, collars of gold, around their necks, as a sort of magical talisman. Others wore trousers, their upper bodies bare or clothed in tunics. Helmets were adorned with horns or crests of animal designs. A few of the chiefs and noble warriors had mail shirts and even the occasional piece of armor for their horses. The Gauls also had a sizable cavalry contingent armed with spears. In pompous displays, nobles may have arrived at the battle site in chariots but then fought on foot or mounted steeds to lead the cavalry. The howls and wild cries of the Gauls, accompanied by blaring of horns and trumpets, resounded over the battlefield as the barbarians worked themselves into a battle frenzy. King Brennus himself leading the Gallic army. The Roman army was led by the tribune Quintus Sulpicius Longus. The backbone of the 15,000 men strong Roman army was the legion. The 6,000 Roman citizens of the legion fought as a phalanx of hoplites, a tactic that was widely used in Greece and Etruria. The hoplites were heavy infantry, armored with helmet, breastplate, greaves, and a bronze round shield. Their weapons were the thrusting spear and the sword. The phalanx of shields and armored warriors, bristling with spears, presented an image of unyielding strength. In addition to the legion there were Roman light troops and 600 cavalry as well as soldiers from allied settlements. Despite the superior numbers of the enemy, the Romans made no attempt to entrench their position. The great numbers of Gauls enabled Senones King Brennus to extend the front of his army far beyond that of the Romans. Trying to match the width of the Gallic front, the Romans took men from their center to extend their own lines. Even then the Gallic army continued to extend beyond the Roman front, and worse, now the Roman ranks had become dangerously thin. The Romans stationed their poorly armed and inexperienced reserves on a small hill on their right flank. Brennus, the Gallic chieftain, suspected that behind the scanty numbers of the enemy lurked some Roman ruse. He feared that the Roman reserves on the hillock would outflank his left wing and strike at his army from the rear while his men were engaged with the legions. As a result, Brennus opened the battle by attacking the reserves, with elite, possibly cavalry, detachments from his left wing. These elite forces were likely chosen for their mobility and ability to quickly move around the battlefield. Brennus may have hoped that this initial attack would catch the Roman reserves off guard and either eliminate them or force them to engage in battle before the main forces met. If successful, this tactic could have neutralized the Romans' potential flanking maneuver and given Brennus a strategic advantage. As Gallic cavalry reached the top of the hill, they saw the Roman hoplites waiting for them. The Roman soldiers stood in a tight formation, their shields locked together in a wall of steel. They held their spears steady, waiting for the Gallic cavalry to charge. The Gallic cavalry commander, a fierce warrior with a long red beard, raised his sword and shouted a battle cry. The Gallic cavalry charged up the hill, their horses kicking up dust and dirt as they thundered towards the Roman line. The Roman hoplites held their ground, their shields absorbing the impact of the charging horses. They thrust their spears forward, trying to catch the Gallic cavalry as they rode by. The two sides clashed in a violent melee, swords and spears slashing through the air. The Gallic cavalry fought with ferocity, their swords flashing in the sunlight as they cut down Roman soldiers. The Romans fought back with equal determination, their spears stabbing at the Gallic warriors from behind their shields. The higher ground provided the reserves with an advantage as they could easily spot the approaching enemy and defend themselves. However, the barbarians were determined to break through the Roman lines, and their brute power and strength enabled them to break through the defense of the reserves. Some of the reserves were driven back into the hills while others were pushed onto the main Roman battle lines. The Roman soldiers on the right wing and center, who were not directly involved in the battle on the hill, heard the sounds of battle and were immediately thrown into confusion. They would have been uncertain of what was happening and may have mistakenly assumed that the barbarians were attacking from a different direction. As the confusion and panic spread, it would have had a domino effect on the rest of the Roman lines. The soldiers would have been disoriented and unsure of what to do, making it difficult for them to coordinate their movements and effectively fight the barbarians. At this moment the whole Gallic infantry charged towards the Roman line with a fierce determination, their war cries filling the air. The two forces clashed in a brief but intense struggle, their swords and spears clashing against each other with a deafening sound. As the battle raged on, the Gallic infantry began to gain the upper hand. Their sheer strength and ferocity were too much for the Roman hoplites to handle. The Gallic warriors fought with a reckless abandon, throwing themselves into the fray with a thunderous charge. The Roman hoplites, despite their discipline and training, were unable to withstand the onslaught. Their shields began to break apart, and their line began to falter. The Gallic infantry pressed their advantage, striking at the Roman hoplites with deadly precision, their weapons flashing in the sunlight. Finally the Roman hoplite line broke, and the Gallic warriors poured through the gap, cutting down the Romans with savage glee. The Gauls could scarcely believe their good fortune. The Roman left wing and possibly all of the center were swept into the Tiber. Here along the banks of the river, there was a great slaughter. The Gallic long swords slashed down upon the Romans like butchers' cleavers. Many legionaries tried to swim across the waters, but those too wounded, or unable to swim, or too hampered by the weight of their cuirasses were sucked down by the current. From the banks the Gauls peppered the swimmers with missiles. The Romans that reached the other side fled to entrench themselves at the deserted site of Veii. On the right wing the situation was much better. The majority of its men retreated into the hills from whence they withdrew to Rome. There they fled to the citadel on the Capitoline hill, but were in such haste that they neglected to close the city gates. The Gauls, at first dumbstruck at their easy victory, looted the dead and according to custom piled up the enemy weapons in great heaps. They then commenced their march on Rome, which they reached on the day after the battle. Ahead of the main host the cavalry carried out reconnaissance and, to what must have been an astonished Brennus, reported that they had encountered no enemy pickets, that the gates to the city were not shut, and no troops manned the walls. Suspicious of the virtually effortless way they had defeated the reputable might of Rome, the Gauls suspected a trap. Instead of marching right into the undefended city, they bivouacked between Rome and the Anio River and sent further patrols to reconnoiter the walls. Within the walls of Rome the wailing and lamentations for the fallen at Allia were replaced by a silent terror of the enemy. Throughout the night the yells and galloping of enemy cavalry could be heard outside the city walls. The only defendable spot was the citadel on the steep Capitoline hill, and there the Senate and those men of military age, along with their families, sought refuge. The priesthood fled from the city, taking with them the most sacred religious relics. As to the common folk, the plebs, many followed the priest's example and streamed out of the city in disorganized mobs to seek safety in the countryside or within neighboring cities. About 3 days after the battle at the Allia, the Gauls entered the city unopposed. Although they had carried out nightly cavalry reconnaissance, they could not have been very thorough. The Gauls were surprised at the large number of people who, along with their possessions, had already slipped through their grasp. The Gauls stationed a squad of troops around the Capitoline hill and then let loose their wrath on those that remained in the city or were still in the process of fleeing. For the next few days and nights, the Romans on Capitoline hill watched helplessly as below them their cherished city was torched by the Gauls. From out of the roaring inferno resounded the shouts of the barbarians and the cries of citizens put to the sword. As the Gauls stormed the citadel, the city lay in ruins, with nothing surviving amid the ashes and rubble. The Gallic warriors were determined to capture the citadel, and they advanced with a battle shout, their weapons at the ready. The Romans, in stark contrast to their defeat at the Battle of Allia, put up a stout defense, determined to protect their city. The Gauls locked their shields above their heads to protect themselves against missile fire, but the Romans remained patient and waited for the right moment to strike. The Gauls advanced up the steep hill towards the citadel, their war cries ringing through the air. As they reached the steepest part of the hill, the Romans charged. With a fierce battle cry, the Romans charged down the hill towards the Gauls. The steep gradient worked to the Romans' advantage, making them unstoppable as they barreled down the hill towards the Gallic warriors. The Romans, their spears lowered, charged straight into the Gallic shields, breaking their formation and causing chaos among the enemy ranks. The Gallic warriors, caught off guard by the ferocity of the Roman charge. The Romans hacked and slashed at their enemies, their weapons flashing in the sunlight. The Gallic warriors fought back with equal ferocity, but they were no match for the Roman legions this time. The battle was fierce and brutal, with both sides fighting for their lives. The Romans proved to be unstoppable, charging down the steep hill and completely scattering the Gallic warriors. The Gallic warriors fought with all their might, but in the end, they were defeated by the Roman legions. As the battle ended, the citadel remained in Roman hands, and the Gallic warriors retreated in defeat. The Romans emerged victorious, their stout defense and fierce charge proving too much for the Gallic warriors to handle. Wisely deducing that any further attempts to take the citadel would be fruitless and only result in more Gallic casualties, and that in any event time was on their side, the Gauls surrounded the capital in a blockade. At Rome, a period of relative inactivity set in with the Romans secure within their hilltop fortification while the besiegers continued their investment. Elsewhere there was more activity. At Ardea the renowned Roman general Marcus Furius Camillus, who in 396 BC had captured and destroyed the Etruscan city of Veii, rallied the citizens against Gallic raiding parties. Not far from Ardea, Camillus and his levy of Ardeans surprised and slaughtered a large throng of Gauls. Similarly, the Roman troops still encamped at Veii fought against various Etruscan bands who, sensing easy spoils, made forays into Roman territory. The Roman army at Veii was steadily swelled by volunteers from the rest of Latium. All that was needed was a capable leader. It turned out to be Camillus. With the consent of the Roman Senate, and notified by a secret messenger, Camillus was nominated dictator by order of the people. According to tradition, the Gauls meanwhile attempted to infiltrate the Capitoline hill by stealth. At night, a small party scaled the hill near the Temple of Carmentis. The climb was precarious, but the party gained the summit and completely eluded the Roman sentinels. The Gauls did not even wake the guard dogs. Fortunately for the Romans, a flock of sacred geese, near the temple of Juno, were in the vicinity of the Gallic infiltration. The geese put up such a racket that the Roman guard was finally roused. Led by a certain Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a veteran soldier, those Gauls who had reached the summit were flung back over the cliff. Manlius confronted two of the enemy. His sword sliced away the right hand of one Gaul, sending a battle axe flying. Manlius smashed his shield into the face of the other, who tumbled down the cliff. The other Gauls, who still clung to the rocks, were dislodged with a volley of javelins and stones. The result of this fiasco was that stricter watch was kept by the Romans. The Gauls, too, tightened their security around the hill, for they had come to realize that messages were passing between Veii and Rome. Despite their valiant defense of the capital, the Roman condition was far from desirable. 7 months of blockade had reduced them to famine. The Gauls also suffered from malnutrition, along with severe outbreaks of malaria, and died in such great numbers that efforts were no longer made to bury the dead. The corpses were simply piled into heaps and burned. Finally, hunger so gnawed at the defenders of the capital that they gave up any hope of being relieved by Camillus. All that was left was to sue for a peace. A conference between the consular tribune Sulpicius Longus and the Gallic chief Brennus resulted in a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold to be paid by the Romans for the peaceful withdrawal of the Gauls. When it was time to weigh the gold, the Gauls produced false weights. The Romans complained, but to no avail, for Brennus threw his own sword on the scales and haughtily proclaimed, "Woe to the vanquished." What happened next is disputed. Livy wrote that Camillus and his army now appeared on the scene. He at once ordered the Gauls to leave the gold and to march away from the city. When they refused to do so, a chaotic battle erupted as Romans and Gauls fought within the streets and alleys of the ruined city. The end was that the famished and disease-stricken Gauls were easily routed and driven out of the city. At the 8th milestone on the road to Gabii, the Gauls rallied but were again defeated by Camillus's pursuing force. Plutarch mirrors Livy's tale, except that he maintains the skirmish in the city resulted in few Gallic casualties and that the Gauls retreated in good order until their defeat on the road to Gabii. In contrast to Livy and Plutarch, Polybius makes no mention of Roman heroics and says the Gauls raised the siege because their own lands were threatened by the Veneti. Diodorus gives us yet another account in which the Gauls left Rome of their own free will after receiving the gold. Later they were defeated on 2 separate occasions, by Camillus at the town of Vitium and by the Caretans in Sabine territory. Most historians consider Camillus's defeat of the Gauls to be little more than a fanciful revisionism by classical historians to conceal the true scale of the disaster at the hands of mere barbarians. But there is probably a bit of truth in the classical accounts. Perhaps the Gauls accepted the ransom because of pestilence and malnutrition within their own ranks, and because of rumors of the Veneti invasion and a possible large gathering of fresh Roman forces in the countryside. On their way home the Gauls no doubt spread into smaller bands to ease their living off the land. Many of these bands might well have been ambushed by Romans and other tribes, and with them part of the ransom gold was lost. Whatever the truth of the Gallic departure, the Romans ever after called their defeat at the Allia the Black Day, and the sack of their city left a memorable impression on them.